Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a major shift happening in education, how we think about it, how we do it.
We've got two really interesting sources to guide us.
Yeah, first, there's Leonard Walks's book from 2014, Education 2.0, The Learning Web Revolution and the Transformation of the School.
Right. Wax was basically saying, look, the internet changes everything.
Uh,
Our old industrial era school models, they're looking pretty shaky.
and then jumping forward, we have a very current piece, September 2024. It's Bob Lynn's article, The Homeschooling Revolution, How Anxiety and Special Needs Are Reshaping UK Education.
And this one shows a really dramatic rise in homeschooling over in the UK,
Yeah.
driven by some very specific pressures.
Exactly. So our mission today is to kind of map these out, see how Walks's ideas about tech and learning connect, or maybe disconnect, with why parents are actually pulling their kids out of traditional schools right now.
Yeah, how does the theory meet the reality on the ground?
Okay, let's get into it.
Well, what strikes me right off the bat is that both sources, though separated by a decade, point to this feeling of strain in the traditional system.
Walks was already saying back in 2014 that, 30 years of school reforms hadn't really delivered.
Yeah, he talked about public schools being in disarray, fading job prospects for graduates, people losing faith.
He really zeroed in on that education paradigm inherited from the industrial era, said it was in crisis.
And now you look at Lynn's article on the UK, and you see that crisis playing out in real families' lives.
That's 60% increase in homeschooling since 2018-19. I mean, that's not a small number.
Not at all. Lynn points out it's a much sharper rise than in many other developed countries. It really suggests, a deep dissatisfaction, maybe even an erosion of trust for a lot of families.
It feels like the system isn't keeping up, maybe.
That seems to be the implication, especially regarding specific student needs.
And Walks, he really saw the internet, Web 2.0, as this massive disruptor.
Oh, absolutely. He said, basically, the entirety of human knowledge is now within reach for everyone.
Which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. How does a traditional classroom, that top-down model, compete with that kind of access?
Exactly. His vision was pretty radical for the time. Schools becoming open learning centers.
What did he mean by that exactly? Like community hubs?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
More decentralized, using ideas from complexity theory, less rigid structure, more adaptive. And he talked about the learning web.
The learning web, like
Yeah.
a network for education.
Precisely. A network paradigm. Very forward-thinking.
But then you read Lynn's piece about the UK now, and the reasons for leaving school feel, well, less about embracing a brand new web of learning and more about escaping something difficult.
That's a really key point. Wax is looking at the huge potential, the technological shift. Lynn is showing us the immediate triggers, the pain points.
Right. Lynn says the #1 catalyst in the UK is anxiety. And an anxiety epidemic, he calls it.
And the other big one is lack of support for kids with special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND.
So it's less we want the learning web and more this current system isn't working for my child's well-being.
That seems to be the dominant narrative Lynn found. Parents feel like they have to homeschool because the schools aren't meeting these profound mental health or special needs. It's a reaction, often born out of desperation.
He includes some personal stories that really hit home.
Yeah, Sarah Thompson's daughter having panic attacks just thinking about school.
Or John Davies constantly fighting to get the right support for his autistic son.
It makes it very real, doesn't it? It's not abstract theory. It's about kids struggling daily.
And Lynn suggests this highlights a growing gap, right, between the rigid way schools are often set up and just the sheer diversity of kids' needs today.
Definitely.
Huh.
And homeschooling, Lynn points out, is a massive commitment. It's not an easy choice.
No kidding. He lists the challenges, the legal hoops you have to jump through in the UK.
The admin, yeah. Then there's the money side. Often means one parent cuts back hours or stops working entirely.
Plus, actually planning and teaching the stuff, that's a huge job.
And the perennial question, what about socialization?
Right. Always comes up. But the fact that so many families in the UK are taking this on, despite all that.
It really does speak volumes about their prior experiences, doesn't it?
Yeah. But it's interesting, Lynn also says that even with all the hurdles, parents often talk about personalized education being a major plus. And that sort of resonates with Walks, doesn't it? This idea of tailoring learning to the individual, which the internet, in theory, allows.
It does. There's a connection there. Even if the initial motivation is anxiety or lack of support, The practice of homeschooling today often involves pulling together personalized resources.
Using online tools, maybe finding specific materials.
Exactly. Tapping into that vast range of stuff available online that Wax saw as the foundation of his learning web, they might be creating their own little open learning centers, just out of sheer necessity.
So the why might be different, but the how sometimes ends up looking a bit like Wax envisioned.
Potentially, yes. In some ways, they're ahead of the curve, forced into it perhaps, but still experimenting with that more individualized approach.
Let's talk about that socialization piece a bit more. Lynn mentions the research is kind of mixed.
Yeah, it's not clear-cut. Critics worry homeschoolers are isolated. Proponents say they socialize differently, maybe better in some ways.
Lynn quotes a Dr. Emma Roberts talking about intentional socialization. What's that about?
It means homeschool parents often have to actively seek out social opportunities. Homeschooling groups, sports teams, community activities, volunteering. It doesn't just happen automatically like in a school playground.
So it requires conscious effort.
Right. And the argument is that this kind of social interaction, often with mixed age groups, can be just as valuable, maybe even more so in some respects, than being primarily with same-age peers all day.
Interesting perspective. It challenges the default assumption about what good socialization looks like.
It does. And Lynn also notes that there's a growing ecosystem supporting these families now.
Right, networks, online groups.
Loads of educational resources being marketed specifically to them. Tutoring services are booming.
But he also says support from local authorities is pretty patchy.
Yeah, it varies a lot. So while there's more support than maybe there used to be, it's not like there's a standardized safety net or consistent help everywhere. It still largely falls on the parents.
And how does the UK situation compare globally? Lynn touches on this.
Well, that 60% increase is really notable. Homeschooling rates are generally lower in, say, Australia or Canada, maybe 1–2%. The U.S. is higher, around 3–4%,
And in Europe?
often much lower. Some places, like Germany, have very strict regulations against it. So the UK surge really stands out on the international stage.
What about long-term outcomes, academically, for instance?
Again, Lynn says the research is mixed. Some studies suggest homeschooled kids do as well, or sometimes even better, on standardized tests.
But there's that issue of selection bias, right?
Exactly. Are the families choosing to homeschool already more advantaged or motivated, which skews the results? It's hard to untangle.
And in the UK, they don't have the same level of standardized assessment for homeschoolers, making it even harder to compare apples to apples.
Right. And beyond academics, research on things like college attendance or life satisfaction is also varied. Some studies show positive outcomes. Others raise concerns about potential gaps in knowledge or transitioning to higher education or careers.
Lynn quotes a Dr. James Wilson urging caution.
Basically saying you can't generalize. So much depends on the individual family, the parents' resources, their commitment, their skills. It's not inherently better or worse. It depends on the execution.
Which brings up that equity question again.
Yes, Lynn flags that concern. If homeschooling works best for those with more resources, time, money, educational background, could it end up widening the gap between the haves and have-nots?
A serious consideration. If the mainstream system is failing some, but the main alternative isn't accessible to everyone, what then?
It puts the UK education system at a crossroads, as Lynn puts it.
Yeah. This homeschooling boom isn't just a niche trend. He sees it as a symptom.
A symptom of potentially a broken system, particularly regarding anxiety and special needs, but also maybe an opportunity.
An opportunity? How so?
An opportunity to learn from why families are leaving, to push for traditional schools to become more flexible, more personalized, more responsive.
So the rise in homeschooling is basically sending a massive signal that something needs to change within the mainstream system too.
That's the argument. It's forcing a conversation about what schools are for and how they can better serve all students.
And this is where it feels like we circle back to Wax, maybe unexpectedly.
I think so, because even though the drivers Lynn identifies anxiety, Send support weren't Watts' main focus back in 2014.
Right, he was more focused on the tech potential.
The underlying desire that emerges from both seems similar, a desire for education that's more learner-centric, more flexible, more networked, more responsive to individual needs.
Which traditional schools, perhaps tied to that industrial-era model Watts criticized, are struggling to provide consistently.
That seems to be the tension. The homeschooling parents, out of necessity, are kind of creating bespoke educational experiences that align, in some ways, with the potential Woke saw in learning web.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening? Well, it seems clear the traditional school system is under immense pressure.
Yeah, pressure from the theoretical potential of technology, like Walks described, offering new ways to learn.
And pressure from the practical realities, shown so starkly in the UK, where significant numbers of parents feel the current system isn't meeting their children's fundamental needs, especially around well-being.
And they're turning to homeschooling, despite the huge challenges, seeking that personalized approach.
You could almost see the homeschooling rise as a real-world, sometimes desperate reach for the kind of learner-focused education Walks argued the internet age demanded. Maybe it's a sign that the mainstream is still catching up to that potential.
It really feels like the whole landscape is shifting. The demand for learning that's more flexible, more responsive, more individualized, it's getting louder, whether driven by tech visionaries or by parents facing immediate crises.
The big question now is how the system as a whole responds.
Absolutely. Will it adapt? Will it find ways to integrate more flexibility and support? Or will we see these parallel tracks diverge even further?
It leaves us with a lot to think about. So here's a final thought for you. Considering everything we have available now, online resources, different ways to connect, and this clear need for more personalized learning, what could a truly open learning center, like Wax Imagine, actually look like in your community?
And what part could technology and maybe more active parental or community involvement play in building something like that?
Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
That's